Squirrel Island because my father's name was also Larry Pratt. We first came here in 1947. I was 5 years old. And my father and I spent a couple of weeks by ourselves in the Hobson Cottage. And my recollections, what I remember most about, and after a couple of weeks, my mother came, and also Eunice Jessup and Jack Jessup, and her then two children. And we shared that house for a couple of weeks. And we liked it so much, we agreed that we would, the following summer, we would rent together, and they rented the Davis Cottage, now the Wells. And I don't remember a tremendous amount about that summer. I've heard stories about it. One of the reasons was I spent 2 weeks of the month in the harbor having my appendix out. My son, the doctor, was absolutely appalled when I told him they put me out with ether in 1948. Anyway, my couple of stories about that summer. My Eunice was always an enthusiast about food and things to cook and things that were cheap and herbs and things. And my mother characterized her cooking in two ways. One was called cusk at dusk, and the other was swill with dill. And the time, I was said that Eunice was in a total snit about getting a fancy dinner ready before the Hennessey. And mother said to her that, why are you getting so agitated about making dinner for a bunch of drunken musicians? Anyway, and then we never rented with the Jessups again. Anyway, and we mainly rented the little White Thompson, now the White Nivison cottage, which incidentally I was told that the Thompsons wanted to sell it to my father in 1951 for $500. Considered too much. That was approximately a year's tuition at a private school in those years, those days. And we continued to come after my parents were divorced. My father and I would come here for a month, and we usually were in the little White Thompson, or if for some reason that was not available, we rented the Peanut next to the Thompson's cottage on the downtown area. Peanut did not have a refrigerator. I remember you had to go down to the dock and meet the 7:30 boat, and they take a block of ice off and put it in the ice box. I continued until I finished college, and I went to work in the Peace Corps. And while I was in the Peace Corps, my father bought the cottage from Sonny McElwain, that formerly belonged to the Halls. And as far as I know, I would say my father, Larry Pratt Sr., was here every year of his life from 1947 until 1990. And he died not in 1999, and he died in the year 2000 at the age of 93. I think Janet has got pictures of his salt and pepper shakers and other eccentricities in the house. Having redone it and rented it, people seem delighted with it all, especially children of a certain age. I don't know what more I have to say about life on Squirrel Island. Do you have any questions, Janet?
Do you want to talk at all about your dad's involvement with the Hennessey?
Oh, well, actually, I should go back up. And my father and Jack Jessup and Wilder Hobson had all been in college together. I don't think my father knew Wilder through the magazine he was on. My father was managing editor, and Wilder had been editor of the literary magazine and on the board of the Yellow Record. And after the war, my father was, we lived in Washington Square in New York, and my father was walking down the street, and he saw Wilder walking down the street, and renewed the acquaintance and discovered Wilder was living on the other side of the square, which is how we got to Squirrel Island. my father, and one of their mutual interests was jazz music. They liked to play amateur jazz. My father organized parties in the city for years, once a month. He would have people, he would hire a hall, and people would come and drink and dance and pay for the hall. And various musicians would show up. It's very hard in a New York apartment to have a bunch of people over to play music. People, the neighbors don't like it. Wilder was always described by, he always described himself in the Hennessey as a second year man. The original Hennessey was with the White House brothers, Brooks and Skiddy. Skiddy being Robert Treat, White House Jr., and Nelson Dingley Ho Sr. and Joe Butler, who was married to Bo Butler. Wilder joined in, that was 1921, and then 1922 was Wilder's first year. And they claimed that they played at least once a year, every year thereafter. Some years I think were much better than others. And there's a lot of fun games associated with it. Traditionally there was publicity night. And they would make up posters and signs and things to put around the island, mainly to baffle and mystify the rest of the islanders. There were many. Usually there was a theme every year. One of the most elaborate ones was the Aga Khan's balls, the rivals and splendor. They had a sign. They made a sign that they put on by the telephone booth at the post office, and had this: the Hennessey Five-Star Orchestra invites you to an Islamic musicale and dervish ballet, which will rival in size and splendor the Aga Khan's balls, and everything except the last three words was in fairly small print, and the last three words you could read from the boat dock. And going with all this, we put signs around the island saying it's Mecca, and that was where it's with this Oriental, with this sort of Middle Eastern theme. That's where they developed one of the slogans which has endured, which is "Free Ghee," ghee being a form of clarified butter popular in that part of the world. Another very elaborate one was the moonshot. They had a sign proclaiming the Russian name, so Soviet astronaut and somebody Shepard, I guess it was, the American astronaut, and Robert Treat White House was the horse's astronaut. We had this roll of linoleum left over from some project, and we got the cement mixer, built a fire in it, and pretended to have a moon launch, which I think didn't fool anybody over about the age of 4. But anyway, Skiddy had this World War I flight, aviator suit with a leather helmet and everything. He snuck away from the proceedings and then emerged from the cove beach carrying a large fish. Fish had been caught by Archie a couple of days before, and was part of the proceedings. Was finally presented at the Hennessey, gift wrapped in a box to Ellie Hastings, then president of Ladies' Hymns. So I'll give you some flavor of how these things went on, and they went on all week. We used to have what was called Hell Week, which was known officially as Fate Week. And Wednesday, they had what they called the Children's Fate Ball. And May Jessup and I, because we had the concession to sell soda, we generally persuade the Hennessey they didn't need much pumping to come down to the casino after the children's thing was over, and people would come in, they'd play, and the people would drink and dance and buy sodas. And the same thing would happen on Saturday night. guess Friday they used to go to the yacht club and play. I think Thursday was considered health night. Oh. And I don't know what more I have to say. If you have any more questions, I'll try to answer them.
Okay.
This house we're in was built by Mr. Danforth. I presume it's a speculation, and I don't think any of his family ever lived in it. Around 1905, we have plans from the Davenport Furniture Company office, which incidentally the historian who was here the other day said he wasn't really sure who designed various Davenport cottages, and as far as I know, at least this one was designed by people in his office, not maybe trained as architects, but they didn't sign the papers. Official name of the house on the papers was the Moorings. I never heard anyone ever call it the Moorings. And I also suspect that this house was designed to be built somewhere else because the drawings show the back of it on level ground and the front elevated rather than same level all around. It was owned for many years by people in Nurpel. This Mary Schweppe said they used to sit out on deck chairs on the porch, wrapped up in blankets all summer. Deck chairs are actually still in the shed. I have no reason to doubt that. And I think their daughter married a man named Riker, who was the people I remember when I was a child living here. This house was always a bit foreboding. It always seemed a little dark. The shades were drawn. You thought you heard muffled screams from inside. And so when a kid walking by, you always walk a little faster when you walk by this house. I heard later, somebody told me later that Mrs. Riker was phobic about water and had to be sedated and carried over on the Marambo and up to the house and spent the entire time she was here indoors, presumably not looking out the window, I guess. But, the only signs of life you'd see in this cottage was with Mr. Riker and somebody, I guess, I don't know, relative or friend or whatever. They would play horseshoes on the front. Anyway, the upshot of all this house is probably never seemed to be used very hard. Most of the stuff in it is original, as far as we can tell. There's matting upstairs. It was probably dates from 1905, and it's a very pleasant cottage. Abby purchased it in about 1984 or 5, I think.
Okay.
Should be.
My father knew Wilder Hobson in college, and after, sometime during the mid-40s, he saw Wilder walking in the street with a baby carriage and discovered that Wilder was living on the north side of Washington Square in New York, and my parents were living on the south side. Also, I think I may have been out of a carriage by that time, but anyway, they renewed their friendship, and Wilder rented his cottage here to my father and my parents, and actually in the second half they shared it with the Jessops in 1947. That's the first time I came here. I was 5 years old. And one of my few memories of that was having supper on the tea house porch with my father and George and Khaki Mandel. My father easily was an avid tennis player and got cozy with the Mandels for that reason. And subsequently we rented and also shared a couple of years the Davis Cottage, which is now Wells Cottage. My mother and Eunice were an interesting pair. There's a story is told that Eunice was all in a lather about getting a dinner for the Hennessey, before the Hennessey, and my mother finally turned to her and said, "Eunice, why are you knocking yourself out for these bunch of drunken musicians?" So it was a different outlook anyway. And I also remember my mother characterized Eunice's cooking in two ways. One was cusk at dusk, and the other was swill with dill.
And that was Eunice Jessup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And anyway, that lasted a couple of years. The second year I was there, I wasn't there that much because I spent 2 weeks in the harbor in St. Andrew's Hospital having my appendix out, which I have a 1948 scar to show for that. Then in subsequent years, we rented what is now the Admiral Niveson's house, the little white one, which belonged to Fred and Anna Thompson. And that went on for 4 or 5 years or so, maybe even longer. We did spend, when that wasn't available, we spent some time in the Peanut, which was also owned by the Thompsons, next door to their house, and not inside of what is now the tea shop. And my parents were divorced in 1954, and after that my father and I came up for the month of August, and we usually stayed in the Peanut. And I don't know, is there something else I can say about the history here? My father finally bought a cottage in 1967, this cottage.
Okay.
Well, my name is Larry Pratt. We're on Squirrel Island. I'm known as Butch Pratt because my father was also Larry Pratt. Just to confuse banks and post offices, we have the same middle initial, but not the same middle name, so I'm not a junior. What else was I supposed to say?
Talking then, I guess, about the Hennessey.
Oh. My father was born in 1906 and grew up in Ohio, and he told me that in those days, if you wanted to have music when you were a kid, you had to make it yourself. So I think he played a lot of different instruments. He started with the cornet, and then he, for reasons known only to him, he took up the accordion, and he had actually had a special accordion made. It said Larry on it in jewels, and had a special keyboard because he had very big fingers, and it was more the size of a piano keyboard than an accordion keyboard, which meant that actually nobody in the world had any interest in it except him as an object. And then he switched to the piano. And some people say it's because his drink kept falling off the accordion. And after he got involved with the Wilder and the Madness up here, he took up the trombone. And that's what he actually preferred to play, although I really enjoyed his piano playing very much. And he was here, as far as I know, from 1947 every year through 1999. The last year he was here, I don't think he missed a single season. And he always played in the Hennessey. And at least in the 50s, the Hennessey was much more elaborate than it is now. Of course, the whole thing was much more elaborate. We had what people called the Fate Week, which other people called Hell Week. And there was a children's fate ball on Wednesday night, which very often the Hennessey would then come and play after the children were thrown out. And then the proper Hennessey was on Thursday night. And then the fate ball was on Saturday night. And very often the Hennessey players would come in on the end of that, and after the musicians went home in their boat. So it went on for a long time. The meals were a little sketchy for kids in the Hennessey household. People say we did a lot of roots and berries and things. That's something of an exaggeration. And sometimes there was a period where they went to the yacht club in Boothbay Harbor on Friday night. So it was a pretty hectic schedule. In addition, of course, they had the tennis tournament there, and my father usually was in that. He didn't get very far, but he liked to play tennis. And my father was an enthusiast. He would go on, he'd get interested in something, and he'd pursue it. Like, for example, these conch shells here, which are all made so you can blow them. Many of them are adjusted so that they match the same notes, or at least what used to be the notes of the wind and the other foghorns that go off around here. And he also developed interest in salt and pepper shakers. I don't know quite why, but I think when he came home from work, there was a store in the subway that sold a lot of them. He started buying them, and they wound up here. And then over the years, people would give him salt and pepper shakers. I've never counted how many there are here, but there are probably at least 250 or so.
Good. How about, that's great. Why don't you talk about Abby and the boys and the next generation that's here now?
Well, okay, that's the other house.
Oh.
Okay, I don't know whether you're going to do that or not.
Well, just, in terms of your family and, the history of it. So.
Yeah. I was in the Peace Corps after college. I came home and met Abby, and we got married. People thought I was a little bit eccentric, or maybe just cheap, but we came here to Squirrel Island on our honeymoon, but I think she had a very good time. One of her first introductions was they had a boat trip. There was a sort of a fake paddle steamer that you could rent out, and they rented that, and it was a very elaborate thing, which I really won't go into, but it involved sighting shitepoke, and which is a main local term for blue heron, and much jollity and music were there, and we all went out on the boat and went up through the gut and made it almost to the Sassanova where it was supposed to take place. And of course the Hennessey was still going. I think they even had the fake ball then. I don't know when they stopped. And so we were here for that, and then we went back and lived in Africa for a couple of years. And because those are the years that I was not on Squirrel Island. Also, the first couple of years when our kids were very little, it was sort of hard to travel up here. And I think we came back in 1972, and we rented, because this house really wasn't big enough for all of us. We stayed in what's now Callaway's, Chase Cottage, Schweppe Cottage for a while. The farthest south I've ever lived on Squirrel Island is Jackie Newberry's, which you rented one year. And then we settled on renting what was then Sprague Theobald's cottage. His mother was Kay Payson, and we rented that for any number of years. And finally, I got a call saying that he had to sell out, and they had to do it quick. So we managed to cobble everything together and get the 7 letters and bought the cottage. So now we have what I never thought it'd be, we have 2 cottages. 2 votes at the annual meeting if we can ever get there.
And your boys?
And our boys were here at least all the time through college and after. Right now they're so busy they find it very difficult to get up here, but I can imagine they will be coming back, as well as my granddaughter.
Why don't you give their names?
My sons are Sam and Bob, Samuel and Robert Pratt, and my daughter-in-law is Dory Pratt, that's married to Bob, and their daughter is Lucy Pratt, and right as of today, there is another one due in about 3 months. There's a boy. They don't tell us what his name is. Another member of the Hennessey was Arnold Roth, who played the saxophone, both tenor and soprano. And he came here many years. Very often, he was a friend of Verna's from Princeton, where they lived at the time. And sometimes stayed with Verna, sometimes with the Jessups. And then after some period of years, he came up with his wife Caroline, and he stayed with my father he and Caroline stayed in this cottage for easily 15 years. running. And sometimes, actually there was a couple of years where they rented and they had their boys up, and then they rented what is now the Bauma Cottage. Or was that the Angler Island?
Yes.
Yeah, something like that. And he is a very funny man, and is a cartoonist. Curiously, when the last time he was here, I got a new cart. This was after my father died. And I had asked him, to paint my initials on the card, and which he did. You can see it's, and those are my father's initials also, but you can also notice that it's Salt and Pepper, S&P. And not satisfied with that, he did a drawing, which is Squirrelzilla, or a painting coming on the island. Arnie's work is sometimes very hard to understand, but it's always interesting and amusing.